Hello and welcome to the channel. Today I would like to discuss a very fascinating topic which is quite difficult for collectors in general, but this is the trying to determine who was the maker of a particular watch. Now, even when we have a signature on a watch, and I'm talking about in general 19th century Swiss pocket watches, even when we have the signature of this individual, we must try to figure out who was the maker. And this can be very difficult. We have to use a variety of resources to get to the bottom of this. And so I'd like to basically explain what the way I have been able to determine the identity behind many of these makers, and discuss some interesting finds or recent discoveries as far as this signing is concerned. So we have these makers, and we're speaking of this Montandon horological dynasty. These watchmakers, they're all related. They all come from the same family in Switzerland. And so let us look at some of these makers. Now, of course, we have a lot of Henry Montandons, and indeed there is a very interesting example of a Henry. Now, this is an individual who was a watchmaker. He was a Napoleonic era watchmaker, and whereas we have probably very few, if not any, watches that we can attribute to him, we do know that he was a very influential individual. He was a judge in La Chaux-de-Fonds. He also became the owner of a historic edifice, which was known as La Belle Maison. And this was the former watch factory owned by the Huguenot brothers, but in particular the Huguenot who was the Inspector General of Watchmaking for the King of Prussia. So after he died, this went through his family. And this is Abraham Huguenot, and this went through his family, and it was eventually purchased by Henri Montandon, this Henri. So we do know this through a carnet that he left, which is essentially a diary, a bookkeeping household book. But we do know that we have his watchmaking. His wife, Marianne, was the daughter of the last owner of this, and she was able to, through her, Henri acquired this, and they paid the amount so that it came to them. So basically we have Henri, that we know who he is, and we're not exactly clear how he signed his watches, but he was a big watchmaker with a lot of fame at this time, and we know that he was starting in watchmaking around 1804. That's when he started the carnet. So that we have a little bit of the knowledge through him, and his information is also confirmed or correlates with the almanac entries that we have for him. Now, there is in Albert Montandon, Geneva. This is another interesting mystery. Not exactly clear who was behind this name. However, this name, this product, Albert Montandon, Geneva, we do know because of an 1869 article in the Swiss press, I believe it was the Gazette de Lausanne or the Gazette de Genève, that this trademark was owned by a company, the widow John Magnan and Guyadan. So this company owned this mark, and now they do have a lot of watchmakers who actually, they were these individuals that worked within that company. However, this Albert is not exactly clear, and it does seem that this is more of a trade name that they acquired. So we do know this through an article in the press. Now, we do have the case of Eugène Montandon, and with him we have to rely on news clippings, articles, and his obituary. But this ties in with the almanac information that we have, the data from La Chaux-de-Fonds, and we find him there having moved from Locla, where he was in the 1870s. Now, prior he had actually been in France, in Besançon, and in this area, but then he relocated to Lokla and then eventually to La Chaux-de-Fonds, and we find him there, and we know that watches signed Eugène Montandon Lokla are actually this individual who, by the 1880s, by the time he was still fabricating, he was in La Chaux-de-Fonds. We have his addresses, and we can relate these to him. And we do know, because of the types of roles he fulfilled, that this must be him. So this is Eugène Montandon. And these watches were all gold. All of the, his watches are very rare. I have been able to locate under half a dozen examples, of which only one is completely intact, and this is a gold watch, which was sold at auction, and it had a serial number of 16660. However, the other pieces are all movements, and these have golden hands with gems. This is a clear indication that these had been golden cased, and the gold was sold as scrap, basically, and the only thing that remains is the movements themselves. So now we also have Alphonse Montandon. Now, once again, that we have to realize that now Alphonse, we have a very easy case. We can actually precisely indicate him because of the election rolls. He is on the election list in the College of Travers, and Alphonse was signing Alphonse Montandon à Travers, and he is listed, this individual, as an établisseur, and this is exactly the type of person who is putting their names on a watch. They're establishing watches. This is the Swiss system that is basically at the top of the food chain. He's selling these to customers, but he is assembling these from parts and putting his name on it and making sure that it runs adequately for the customer. But this is his production. So, but once again, it has to be understood that when we're discussing these makers, that an easy answer, you should not expect an easy answer, but you should expect a discussion. And that is what we tend to have with a lot of these. And this is a little bit of an idiosyncrasy with the last quarter of the 19th century. Now, previously to this, in the 18th century and in the first half of the 19th century, the identity of these makers is much more clear. Like, for example, Louis Montandon of Geneva, he was signing Louis Montandon Geneva. However, he wasn't actually in La Chaux-de-Fonds, and he's the only Louis that we can find this early making watches in this 1840, 1850 period, or early 1850s. So we know that this is most likely him. But when we get to the other Louis, which is L. Montandon, and this is not Geneva, but Lokla. So we already have two different signings, and this individual, we have to depend upon almanac listings for this individual, and this gives us a pretty good idea of who this was. And the fact that the suspected individual, which is Louis Frederic, was first in business in Le Brenet, doing exactly what he was doing, this level of professional, the ability that he had, these professional know-hows, and the tasks that he performed, that we knew that this has to have been him, or this is fairly certainly him. And he also sustained a bankruptcy. Later we find him relocating from Le Brenet to Lokla, and it is there from 1868 where we find him in league with Montandon Frères on Rue de la Côte. But these watches signed L. Montandon Lokla are precisely from this period, between 1860 and 1880. Now, he died in 1882. But all this information generally pushes us towards him as the most logical individual. Now, his technical capability, his competence, his competence was in he was a repasseur, a remonteur. So this is an ironer and a fixer. These are these names in the Swiss watchmaker names. That this is more than watchmaker, which is a very standard appellation. These titles reveal the technical ability of this individual, which was very high. This required the ability to basically make these watches function, repair the watches, but this was this level of competence that was bringing this also to the end user. However, he was probably a very small businessman. However, he was using his skills in league with Montanin Frères. However, he had the right to fabricate under his own name, and that's why these watches do not have a Montanin Frères stamp. This was something that he was selling. This was his intellectual capital, if you will. So, but we also have other individuals now. F. Montandin. Now this is Frederic Montandin, and we are able to discover his identity because of an article in, I believe it was around 1865 from the Swiss press, with regards to an astronomical clock that was made by his mother's brother, and it brings us to his street address listing in Davoine Almanac, and we were able to see all of his listings, and therefore we know that he was in, and we do find that in one of these articles in the press, and in another article he's listed as an établisseur. Therefore, we can relate that F. Montandin Locla was indeed this Frederic Montandin who was in Neuchâtel City. So we have quite good, and there's nobody else to really address this technical capability, business ownership, and the Almanac listings, which put him as a fabricant de horlogerie, which is a watch manufacturer, but also we have the information of him being an établisseur. So we do have that. Now, we also have Ulysses. We have several Ulysses. One is U. Montandin of Saint Croix, and this is very interesting. We know that this individual was a Ulysse Montandin. There was two. There was a father and a son, and Edward Ulysse would have been the one that was coming later, but he was actually in partnership with Jacquard, and Jacquard et Montandon in Saint Croix were signing Geneva. So it's interesting. Many watches from this period of Montandin Geneva signings very probably were U. Montandin of Saint Croix. However, this is a little speculative, but we do know from genealogical information there is a treatise, a genealogical treatise called Les Montandons, and this specifically attributes that this house was run by the father and the son. Now, a brother was also present, Edward Ulysses' brother, and this was Louis Emile. He was a lieutenant colonel, and we find he was the one who perfected this telemeter, Télémètre Montandon, which we find a lot of articles in the Swiss press explaining that Louis Emile, or Emile Montandin, who was a lieutenant colonel in the Swiss artillery, he developed this watch and patented it under the house of U. Montandin of Saint Croix. And indeed, the watch has this poinçon, this maker's mark. So this is quite fascinating. We do know this, but there is a second U. Montandin, but this is U. Montandin Robert of Geneva, and this is also Ulysse Montandin Robert. Robert is the family name. Now, he fortunately signed his watches U. Montandin Robert. Therefore, because of the alliance, we're able to, without any doubts, assign the person behind this. He is quite famous. He was a chronometer champion, and we actually have a lot of other ancillary data, historical data from these competitions where he was taking a lot of medals. He took a lot of medals, especially in England at the Kew Observatory trials. And he was predominantly doing this in the entire decade of the 1890s. So he was very, very well looked at. Now, another interesting individual is A. Montandin. This is A. Montandin Locla signed watches. And this most certainly is Auguste Montandin. And we do know that around 1881, 1882, there was an special competition. This was a competition, an exhibition in La Chaux-de-Fonds. And this Auguste won a special récompense, as they say, or an award. And he received merit, and it's because of this, his watch, that we can fairly certainly attribute that Al Montandan Lokla, and it is exactly this period, this is this August, and we know who he is because of this. Now, there was a second August who was also a watchmaker in Nyon. This is in the south in Vaud. This is getting closer to, this is on Lake Geneva or Lake Lamont. But this individual, now his father was an Henri Montanin, H. Montanin of La Brevine. And now this is very interesting now. His father is a contender of one of the most disputed watchmakers in this brand, and this is H. Montanin Lokla. Now, with August, we are fairly certain that this is him because in one of his watches, and this is a gold watch, and his watches tend to be more rare. This is one of the rarer ones of these Montanin Lokla signed pieces. But there is a ponçon by a fabricator who made the case, and this is Julien Gallet and Co. And the ponçon in this case dates from the early 1880s. I believe it was after 1883, around 1884, and this piece is about mid-decade, this 1884 to before 1890 time period. So once again, almanacs with these datings bring us to this particular August. But now this H. Montanin Lokla, this is the hardest one. This is where that we should not expect an easy identification. We should expect a discussion. And with H. Montanin Lokla, this is the key. It is very hard to nail down who this individual was. There were a lot of Henrys. This is a Henry Montanin, and we have a lot of Henrys in all the almanacs. However, and watchmaking, the grade of watchmaker that one could be putting one's name. So we have an individual who is in Lokla, Henri Montanin Nardin, and he married a Nardin that was related to Ulysse Nardin's brand. This was the brother's daughter, the brother of this Ulysse Nardin brand. So he is a strong contender for these H. Montanin pieces. We find them from the 1870s up until the early 1890s, early to mid 1890s. We have a lot of these H. Montanin Loklas. They start out as Lapine pieces. These are all gold watches. Every single one is gold. Cannot find a single silver watch, and as a result, these tend to appear as only movements. However, when watches appear, they're all gold. So we can infer that he was making only gold watches. However, even if we look for manufacturers of montres d'or or montres or this also, there is no Henry that is specifically related to gold watch manufacturing. Now, there is another interesting basically an almanac that is in German, and this is for the owners of various different watch companies. And there is a Henry Montanin, who is the father of Auguste, who was from La Brevine area, and he actually had two locations. He had a location in, I believe it was Cernier, right in this area, close to La Chaux de Milieu, but this would have been a mountain area. But he also had a second shop in La Chaux de Fonds. And so now he had been generally recognized to be selling watch equipment, watchmaker equipment, tools, but also movements. He was a movement manufacturer. However, it is entirely possible that this individual, because he had this location in Chaux de Fonds, that he was, not only was he selling parts of watches and watch equipment, he was fabricating watches in addition and selling these as luxury watches. This is a mountain producer. So it could be that he is the H. Montanin Lokla that we're looking for. Of course, he wouldn't have used a mountain location. Now, Alphonse was very, he is the only Montana maker who uses traverse, and he was from Traverse. This is a very rustic, interesting appellation or signing for the watches. So, but if you're selling to the US or around Europe, you're going to put either Lokla or Geneva on a watch. And the gravity, obviously Geneva has one of the highest appellations, even above Lokla. But Lokla had a very high reputation, and therefore it was a good way of selling a watch that if everybody wanted watches from Lokla. So he's going to put Lokla on his watches. So we do have this. Now La Chaux de Fonds would later become a much more geared up towards mass production after the 1880s. The competition with the US, they began to move the large-scale production into from Lokla to La Chaux de Fonds. So we have we start to see this La Chaux de Fonds more and more appearing on the watches. Now it was there previously in the early days, but it didn't have the international status that Lokla had because of all these international competitions where these Montanan watchmakers were making the big wins and the winds and making waves and across the sea, so to say. But so we have all of this, and this is all quite fascinating. But this H. Montana Lokla, it's very possible now that we have this ancillary information from this German almanac stating that he had multiple locations, that he was, so this is a very high contender. Now he was a business owner, and he appears to be viewed as a watch manufacturer. So we may be dealing with our H. Montana Lokla in his phase. But the other option is this Montanan Nardin, and he was a Montanan Lalonde. This is the genealogical branch. They're very illustrious, and they have a lot of big watchmakers, especially in the early 19th century. But so we have sort of this, and we also have Henry, who was Henri Louis, who went to Besançon. Him and his son was also named Henry, Henri Edward, and he was signing watches, Henri Montandon, fabricant à Besançon, but he also established himself in Paris. He moved to Paris by the 1890s, and we find him with a manufacturer in Besançon, but production was going for his Paris counters where he was selling his watches. But a lot less likely, nowadays it does seem that it's a lot less likely that Henri Louis and his son were behind this H. Montana and Lokla. However, it cannot be totally excluded at this point. But now I did want to share a very interesting article, and this goes all about when we're looking at these watch signings. That's who is behind these watch signings. So Montanan first Lokla, it's the most illustrious Montanan watch fabricator, and this was the Montanan Blaise Léon de Lokla branch, and they were behind this brand, and this brand now they established themselves in Paris and Lokla. Now the Paris group was more or less on the production of watch and clock springs, but there was the Lokla cousins and brothers. The oldest one had a brother, but then the rest went through him, and they were all cousins. So they did sell in Paris watches from their location, very close to the Louvre, up until about 1850. And after that, they sold sort of this name, this Montanan Frères, to this Perinaud, Francois Perinaud. And so a series of individuals after him, his assistant or business partner, and then after this, a very famous watchmaker, acquired this Montanan Frères name. So when we find there is a very interesting article that has appeared from Montevideo, from the Uruguayan press. And this is from, I believe, 1882. And this is right after the Melbourne win for Montanan First Lokla. But it is a warning. It is a warning by Montanan First Lokla that it's as follows. This is not from Montanan First, but this is from a club of several admirers of the Montanan First Lokla watch. So this was a very celebrated company, manufacturer. So they wrote this, and they are actually a group that was based in Havana, Cuba, but this article that I found was from the Uruguayan press from Montevideo. So we warn all buyers of first-class watches. Do not confuse the Montenefer's Genève with the watches from the famous and renowned Montenefer's Lochla, Switzerland, which won so many prizes at all of the Universal exhibitions since 1855, and especially at the last Melbourne, Australia exhibition. This was in 1880-1881, where it achieved the highest reward. They received the maximum points possible. I believe it was 500. They received the maximum points possible for their watch. And that's the last, incidentally, the last exhibition where they presented. So let's continue with the article. All watches from this ancient house, founded in 1790 and marked Montenefer's Lochla, are accompanied by their corresponding certificates, signed Montenefer's, in the handwriting of the head of the house. And at this time, this was Charles Adolphe Montandon. Now, he was, after 1882, by 1883, 1886, around this period, he would become, he had a long-term illness. He would become so ill that his son took over the business, Charles Albert. And indeed, when Charles Albert was traveling, we find a letter of attorney, or power of attorney rather, for Charles Albert's wife, Sophie, to have signing rights while he was away, apparently I believe he was traveling in Argentina, and they eventually, in 1888, when they established, when they liquidated the business, they established the largest cocoa plantation in all of the Antilles, and this was in the Dominican Republic. So this is interesting that we find that they also, buyers of these watches had a handwritten note from Charles Adolphe Montandon, or later Charles Albert, basically verifying the quality of the watch, etc. Now, for the Mexican market, we do know that they were given, these were all luxury end watches now. These were 18 karat usually watches, etc. A lot of very complicated pieces, including moon phase calendar watches, etc. For the Mexican market, they were giving a metal token that was pre-stamped in Spanish, explaining that this was the production of Montenefer's Lochla, and then etched on the coin would be the particular serial number of the watch. So this token could be presented to the dealership where it was purchased for servicing as a warranty or guarantee, etc. So I just wanted to demonstrate this last article from this group of admirers in Havana, Cuba, from May 24th, 1882, basically protecting and warning the public about the do not confuse Montenefer's Geneva with Montenefer's Lochla. Hey, now what does this mean? This means that the name was so celebrated and famous, and the quality of this product was so high that either watches signed Montenefer's Geneva, now they are either counterfeits or competitors. Now, if they were competitors, it must be attributed, this is most likely this group in Paris that were selling from their old premises, that they bought the rights to this Montenefer's name. And indeed, there is at least one watch which is signed Paris and Geneva, Montenefer's Paris and Geneva, but it also has the name of the reseller. Well, this isn't actually the reseller, but he retained the rights to this brand name there, and this is for the French market only. So it does seem that now I had thought that because of all almanac listings for Montenefer's French almanac listings, they mentioned this. It's called a commissioner. Now this is somebody that is appointed to make sales. Now I had always assumed that they were selling, that the Montana First Lokla was producing watches for them, which they sold on and realized. This may be the case. However, it does seem that they were more in competition with each other. And Montana First Lokla already had this international market that they were selling to. They were very big in U.S. and they had U.S. They had places in Europe. They had London, for example, and Dublin, but they also had New York, San Francisco, New Orleans. So they were selling watches from established dealers via them, but they were extremely big in South America, including Mexico and Veracruz. But we also know, obviously, that they were in Cuba, and it does appear that they were in some of the other republics: Argentina, Ecuador, Paraguay, Brazil, etc., Peru. These watches do seem to be all over in South America. So, but we do probably have a situation where their reputation is being defended by these enthusiasts who know that this is a different company, and I do believe that this probably, and I don't. Once again, the almanac listings, the French almanac listings say that they have production for Montana Furs, the brand that was sort of sold, the name that was sold in Paris, that they have production in Lokla, Geneva, and Besançon. Now later these would taper off. After Montana First Lokla in 1880 liquidated, we're not seeing it anymore. So it is entirely possible that they were selling a certain amount of watches signed Montana First Lokla to this branch. Still, they were in competition. Now later we see that this the individual who continued with this name from Paris selling, that we see that production, and this is the early 1890s, that only Geneva is mentioned. So this was a subcontractor who was producing the movements and the parts, etc. This was on, I believe it was Mont Blanc, perhaps number 20. Rue Mont Blanc, number 20 in Geneva. They were the subcontractor for Montana Furs, probably signed Geneva, but also Geneva and Paris, we do know. So this does appear to be the case. We are getting closer to the truth behind these makers with these articles that we find in our research, and combining them with multiple other sources, including historical press clippings, electoral rolls, genealogical information, etc. We have all these various sources, and this helps us in our identification. So I hope that this long discussion was of interest, and it gives a little bit of a flavor about these makers. Now, a lot of these makers were probably working in close collaboration. However, they, when these makers, for example, L and F and A, Montana and Lokla, when they had the technical ability to produce watches, they were probably able to sign with their own name. They did not use the Montana for a stamp. However, they were probably enjoying the same suppliers in many of the parts that they were getting. That clearly these watches, they tend to be, they're not as, in general, they're not as high grade as Montana Furs, which was the top luxury level of watch production in all of these makers. Yet, we do have this. I did want to share it with you. I hope it was of interest. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. So thank you for your time, and I wish you a nice weekend. Bye-bye.